Hey, good morning, everyone. Mike Fisher back to do another video on something to do with fear and fearlessness. My topic of specialty for the last 30 years, pretty much. And the topic today is really going to focus on words and concepts and meanings that have and are related to fear per se. Let's start with that. I hold the dictionary up, of course, because I'm always interested how it helps us articulate a whole worldview, a whole set of meanings. And yet, of course, there were times that we communicated as human beings for generations prior to someone writing words out and meanings and definitions. So as much as I say I'm really keen as someone who specializes in research and education on fear and fearlessness in the world today as a part of a liberation process, I also want to say that definitions and meanings and all these concepts and theories are not just the only way to really be a wise human being and make good decisions for the future generations. So get back to words and concepts. I'm always interested when yesterday we had a housewarming at our house, Barbara and I, and there were some people around, and of course you start talking and they were strangers. They didn't know me, some of them. So they asked me, so what do you do? And of course they were looking at my library back here and seeing the word fear in a whole lot of books and file boxes, as you might see from where you are even. So they very quickly, of course, say, well, so what's all this about fear? And of course I say, well, I've been on this researching for a long time, and this is kind of my project. Where I would want to go and where I think humanity needs to go is to build a much better education. I even sometimes use the word critical literacy on fear. I'll just stay with that right now rather than talking about fearlessness per se. I'll talk about fearlessness a little later with introducing the book I wrote on fearlessness in 2010. So people often ask, as a person did yesterday, very intelligent young guy, and he says, oh, so you study fear? He said, and of course, it's almost every time I do this in public settings, even in educational settings, institutional settings, when I'm teaching or just being me and talking to people about who I am, people start immediately to say, oh, fear. Oh, well, fear is natural, and fear helps us survive, and it helps me survive. And I have some fears, and they just start a conversation. And what's interesting, I find, as a researcher and an observer of the human phenomenon, is a certain kind of arrogance that we carry. I'm going to speak about people in the Western world. That's where I live, in North America. And amazing, they hear, I've studied this for 30 years, and I'm an expert in this topic. And I'm not bragging or anything. I just say it as just information. And it's like it goes in one ear and it goes out the other, and then they start telling you all about fear. and they're so amazingly confident when they do this. And they're sitting there in front of me, telling me what fear is and what fear isn't. And they have this whole kind of knowledge. Not that's a bad thing. It's a natural thing, I guess, for all of us to acquire certain knowledge on certain ideas and concepts and have our definitions. But they're just so confident. And of course, some part of me says, well, so what books have you read on fear? And have you read more than one? And I don't do that. That would be a little probably embarrassing to them. So I listen, and then sometimes I'll put in a little bit of what I have learned over 30 years, which is more than a little. And of course, by that time, most people are kind of overwhelmed and ready to move on, looking at their watch, or next there's somebody else to talk to. So the topic this morning is really on this very quick tendency, this habit, what Pierre Bourdieu, the French philosopher, theorist, critical thinker, spoke about as the habitus, the set of habits, the discourses, as Michel Foucault might talk about, that build around certain ideas, certain concepts in a society, and then people accept them as the norm. This is the way to know, and they get very rigid in their beliefs about that term or concept. And fear, I find, is one that people really get possessive about. And I start to think, well, is that fear itself talking to me about fear? Well, that's kind of a bit of the way I think. So um, that's a little intro of my experiences of human arrogance, which I also say is fear-based. There's also human ignorance, which is some people being confident, but actually you can tell they're actually quite ignorant. They actually don't know anything, but are trying to pretend they know something. And others think they know a lot and will talk with that confidence, and it comes across again quite arrogant. Well, how do I know it's arrogant? Well, first thing I know why it's arrogant is they don't ask me any questions generally about, well, what do you think of my definition of fear, Dr. Fisher? You've been studying this topic for 30 years. You might have something to say about it. Well, the reason they don't, and again, I've watched this for decades in North America, is they don't really want to know. They don't really want to know, which means they don't want to be critiqued. And someone who's an expert will probably critique someone who is not an expert on maybe, some shortages or limitations of their view of fear and fear management and coping with fear or whatever, conquering fear. Many of the things that these people will tell me in these conversations, how confident they are, this is how I handle fear, and this has worked for me, and so on. So I got this edge of, I don't want to be critical of people's own fearuality, their own development of their relationship with fear. That's just really sacred to me. So I want to respect that. And at the same time, yeah, when you study fear in the kind of way I have, you're going to be critical of people's habitus, their habits, their common discourses, their common worldviews on the topic and on reality itself, really, because studying fear is a great way to understand human experience, human motivation, and how humans put together a notion of reality. So the dictionary becomes a sort of arbitrary way to understand meanings and definitions, right? I mean, we all use them, and times I will use them too. And you can look up the definition of fear in a lot of papers, and people's books on how to deal with fear will start with fear, the dictionary says, or they'll do an etymology through Oxford Dictionary or some scholarly work on the meanings of words and the terms and where they come from, history, linguistically. All of that, dictionary, linguistics, etymologies, all, as far as I'm concerned, are an attempt to be value neutral, be invisible, and be dominating, or what Antonio Gramsci would call hegemonic, attempting to create a very narrow and dominating discourse, understanding, definition, meanings, ideas on reality. And our relationship as humans to fear is very important and part of that. And I do not use a dictionary. I do not use a medical encyclopedia or a psychiatric manual or a study of the etymology of fear to help me understand fear. I use it a little bit, but only enough to say, well, thank you very much for, whoever the authorities are that have put out these books of this is what this means, which is kind of a horrible oppressive statement to say this is what this means, and everyone should follow it, and right, because it's in the dictionary. Okay, that's not a good education process, and it's not a critical literacy. Critical literacy is a concept I take. There's probably many ways to understand critical literacy. So dictionary literacy is what I'd call a norm literacy. It's attempting to be neutral and look like it's average and common sense, and yet it's actually built on a huge bias of opinions and ideas and data and real information. So it's not like it's ignorant or arrogant per se, but how we use it, then it can become ignorant, and it can become arrogant how we actually use those definitions to try to dominate, just like these people in these conversations I have and talking at this party. They dominate the conversation just so typically when it comes up to, oh, you study fear, Dr. Fisher, and wow, this is what I know, and the way they go. And pretty soon you see that they have no space, no room, unless I get pushy, which I sometimes do, to actually say, well, actually there's a lot more to it than that. And so this is the complexity that's involved in critical literacy compared to a simplicity in the habitus, common ways of using concepts to understand reality, to understand ourselves, and in this case, to understand fear as an experience and fear shaping of experience. So, I want to write different kinds of books. And so in 1995, I pretty much started in 1989. I really started collecting information, and a lot of these files and books can go back to that time in terms of gathering as much information as I could on fear. I said, I don't want to just understand what dictionaries and authorities are telling me about fear. I had this natural sense of being curious beyond that, and I also was critical. Some part of me didn't trust that, fear itself isn't involved in the actual definition and conceptualization and defining of fear, including dictionaries. So I'm unwinding those, deconstructing those understandings and the habitus around the notion of fear. And that's kind of a social, political, historical, critical literacy, cultural studies, feminist, post-colonial, post-structuralist, post-modern, critical thinking. And I am a critical theorist, philosopher, and I am a critical pedagogue, teacher, critical educator. And I have been thankful to learning from those from many different people. Paulo Freire, the great Latin American scholar and pedagogue, has had great influence on me in my education when I went into study education later in life. And he is known as a great mentor and of critical pedagogy and critical literacy, that he helped the oppressed. Pedagogy of the Oppressed, famous book in 1972, I believe, that really was an attempt to show how we can build critical literacy in people who don't have a formal education or have some formal education, to get to understand their own habitus, their own common discourses, their own arrogance and sometimes ignorance, not as a put down in the fact that they may be, quote, ignorant, as, quote, uneducated. No, it really is a sincere effort to help them empower themselves through critical pedagogy, through the development of a critical literacy. So that's a whole other conversation of how you do that on the ground with people. But the most simple way that I would do it with anyone, and I would do it at this party if I was so inclined to do it, which I'm not usually, is to take over and become a bit of a teacher if people were curious, to be critical of their own understanding of fear and be critical of their own understanding of how fear controls and shapes their life. And sure, that may be positive and it may be negative, and a bit of both. And probably, in my view, it's a lot more negative than positive, because of the culture of fear that's been building and coalescing to create a very toxic form of fear. And that's really where this little booklet came from in 1995, that I wrote a monograph on fear, and you can see the little marks up in there, fear. And that was to excite, so that's Introduction to Defining Fear, a spectrum approach or critical integral approach. That marking of fear was my attempt to say, okay, I don't want to just take the habitus of fear, the dictionary meaning of fear, and then develop theories and ideas and do research from there and teach fear management education. I said, no, I want to start with a critical literacy. So I'm going to put those marks on and say, well, that kind of fear, when I talk with the marks on, I'm really saying is assuming that it's a good idea not to set two straight habits, conventional notions of fear down as the foundation for all thinking and for all knowing about our relationship to fear, the development of our fear duality. So that's the critical literacy start. So I teach critical literacy, and I would love to pull out that little brochure, that little monograph, and say to people, here you go. You might want to think about the way you define fear. You know what? It's actually quite problematic. That's all I'm saying. It's quite problematic. And then if I was really perhaps showing off, which is not what I want to do, I would say, well, I've actually done 71 monographs on this since 1995, and you might actually want to investigate fear a little deeper than you have. Well, why would I, put that in front of people? I just want to say, because nobody else is doing that. Nobody else is sort of saying, hey, you know what? You actually can define fear differently, and you can start with a critical perspective, which means a liberational perspective and a emancipatory perspective on your own fear education, how you educate yourself using guides and me and or others or publications of all kinds of people. Don't just use me. My thinking. And so how you can actually educate yourself. And that's really what the whole work that I do is about. How can you do that? And my job as an educator, critical educator, pedagogue, is to assist you to develop the vocabulary, the critical literacy for that. Sometimes I use the word expand your imaginary around the concept of fear itself. And at the same time, always being critical philosophically, or just critical. You don't have to be a philosopher to be critical about how fear knowledge has been shaped. Okay? So, that's basically what I was wanting to talk about, show you a few things. I'm going to show you the next project. So this, by 1995, when I started that series of technical papers from the In Search of Fearlessness Research Institute, they became a foundation for the way that I could think, and many of them are sketchbooks, really, of my ideas and thinking. And then eventually by 2010, probably 2008 is when I started writing this book, which came out in 2010, The World's Fearlessness Teachings, which is my critical integral approach to understanding fear management education in the 21st century. A big long title, and it's a big long book. If anyone's gone through it, even it's 400 or 500 pages, but it's really small type, and there's really lots of endnotes and that are very tiny print, and there's a lot of text in there. I often say it's kind of a 25-year project to write that book. That's how long it took to put it all together in one book, and it's really called it The World's Fearlessness Teachings, and I want to say a word about that. When I first started that research idea, I said, I want to write a summary, a huge kind of book, a critical book on understanding all the different ways that people have, patterns of ways. Obviously, can't do everybody, but I would do as many people as I could study how they understood fear and how they talked about it and taught it and gave prescriptions for how to overcome fear, whatever it might be. I wanted to have a summary of those models and theories and the thinking and analyze it and put it into patterns and categorize it as I like to do as a fearologist. And then people would have a kind of full set or a large set, most of the set of how humans have come to deal with fear. And again, I would do across cultures, across time and history, which I did in the fearlessness book. I wanted to do that with the fear book, and so it was going to be the world's fear teachings. That was the first idea, volume 1. And when I started getting into it, it was just a massive amount of work. And I never really could kind of pull it off. Well, I could have pulled it off, but it would have been a longer project, many more years to get the book together. And then I sort of thought, I don't think it's going to be that interesting to people, because based on my conversations with people, they don't have a lot of attention to talk about fear. Yeah, it's a bit of a problem. So to do a big book like that, who's going to actually read it and get anything from it of any value? So backed off that idea and came around to say, okay, well, why don't you do a book on fearlessness? Because fear and fearlessness always move in a circle to me. Fear moves to fearlessness moves to fear. It's a dialectic kind of theory that I've used and other people have too. So that's why the book got put on hold, and I said, someday I'll write that book, and I still really want to. I will need some good research support people to help me do it, though, not just do it all myself, as I usually do. So the world's fearlessness teaching was much more, I thought, kind of works on the more positive, if you will, fearlessness, right? It's kind of moving already in just its language to not being so oppressed by fear, and writing, having this massive amount of theories and ideas about fear that I was asking people to understand to improve their own critical literacy on fear. Just not very appealing from market point of view, and it's sort of almost a bit oppressive and despairing, perhaps as well, to have a book like that. So I thought this would be more cheery. The world's fearlessness teachings. Well, not too many people read this book, and it really isn't meant to be read in another way. It's kind of like a dictionary. You don't really read a dictionary generally, and you go in and you take bits and pieces and learn what you can. So this book, World's Fearlessness Teachings, would be a book I would highly recommend if you want to understand my view and how I frame theoretically this critical integral approach all around building a critical literacy. So I have other books and other videos. I'm going to talk about some of my other books after this 2010 book. And yet I wanted to really highlight that book and just say in the last chapter of it, as I end this video, I'm just going to check and see exactly what the last chapter title is. Well, let me just read the 5 chapters that I have in this book. The first one is, do we really want a fearlessness revolution? Question mark. I'm asking humanity that question. Do we really want a fearlessness revolution? Chapter 2 is Fear Management Systems Theory, a critical approach. And that's where I articulate that when I summarize and look at the humanities discussion and recordings and documentation of how they understand fear at various different levels of consciousness, which is another piece of analysis I put into my critical theory. I identify, 9 to 10 fear management systems patterns of how fear is organized into these habitus formations, the discourse formations, and how that influences the fear imaginary, and then how people will try to manage fear or deal with fear. And they go from simple systems in a spiral of development to the most complex. So 9 to 10 of those systems I identify in the book. And then I talk about the world's, chapter 3, the world's fearlessness teachings, managing the human fear problem. And I make a big deal about what is the fear problem. My idea of the fear problem in a critical, emancipatory way, as someone who's also an expert in the field of fear studies, compared to someone at the party the other night, their idea of what the fear problem is. That's immediately why we can't have a conversation other than, a very casual and superficial one, is because the person I'm talking to, and this is extremely common, is they are not articulating the fear problem itself before we start talking about what fear is and how we manage it. And okay, you can talk about your experience, and that's great, but you still have not conceptualized. And I can see they've done it, conceptualized perhaps implicitly or in an automatic way, but are not actually aware of their own thinking of how they've conceptualized and structured the fear problem. And what are the problems with structuring the fear problem? We have to ask that too. Perhaps Dr. Fisher or others are making too big of a deal out of the fear problem. It's a possibility. If that's so, I probably wasted 30 years trying to figure that out, that, gee, maybe I've made too big of a problem of the fear problem. But, you have to, as a critical thinker, you have to examine everything you do and think and put it under the lens of critique. Not in a nasty way, not in a put down way, not in a shameful way, in a way that's actually going to advance consciousness and awaken us to perhaps more true realities that are possible along this path of fearlessness that I talk about. Chapter 4, and this is where it really gets interesting and probably is most related to the video today, is education is lifelong learning. Do we really want to raise fearless children? Another question I ask humanity. And the lifelong learning is to study fear in a lifelong learning way, just as if I would study sexuality or morality or spirituality. Fearuality is important, and it's equally important as understanding those other dimensions of human experience. The last chapter, unifying the fearlessness movement. And that's what this book really sets the foundation for understanding. There's a historical fearlessness movement, I argue. A history of fearlessness related to fear. Yes, there's a history of fear, as well as more people have written books on that, historians and others. There's no book to this day on a history of fearlessness. And even my book is not really a history of fearlessness, but it really is the foundations for someone writing a good history of fearlessness. So the fearlessness movement is the response, the liberational and emancipatory project that humanity has undertaken. Thank you, humanity. Thank you, intelligence. Thank you, creator, for helping us as a species come to a better relationship with fear into the future. We have to. The fear problem, to me, is so severe, it will probably take us out in not too long a time if we do not get a better understanding of fear and fearlessness. So that last chapter 5, unifying the fearlessness movement, which basically means there's a lot of people with a lot of scattered information, and you can see my library back there, hundreds and hundreds of books and articles on fear and fearlessness and other things, that they're not synthesizing that information. There's very few people who synthesize even a little bit on the topic of fear, and that is a problem. That's part of the fear problem, is we haven't synthesized, unified our knowledge and understanding of fear, period. And then we haven't done so as I tried to unify somewhat in this book and my other articles, put it under a critical integral approach of synthesis that would unify and start to give us a collective knowledge, kind of drawing on the best wisdom from a whole lot of different sources and cultures and peoples and thinking. The creative, richness of humanity itself in understanding fear. All right, so that's what I really wanted to do, and I argue in the book that we're far behind. Fear is a bit ahead of us. That was a euphemism, by the way. Fear is way ahead of us in terms of the problems it's causing compared to our critical literacy to pull it apart and understand and synthesize a better understanding of fear education, for fear management, for fear transformation, for healing and liberation. So look forward to your comments and look forward to further conversations on this topic. Okay.